The surgeon who saved the Apache woman, a fugitive doctor's last chance at redemption, Dr. Bap. Elias Monroe had once lived a life that many people would call perfect. In Boston, he had a steady job at one of the city's busiest hospitals. People trusted him with their lives. He could perform surgeries that seemed impossible to others. His hands were steady, his mind sharp, and his heart dedicated to saving people. Patients called him a miracle worker, and his colleagues respected him deeply. But life, as it often does, had a way of turning everything upside down. It began with a single operation, a surgery that should have been routine. A young man had come into the emergency room with a serious but treatable injury. Dr. Schnow. Monroe had performed hundreds of surgeries like this before, yet in that moment a small error, a slip of concentration, a wrong measurement, changed everything. The patient survived, but complications arose. Rumors started. People whispered. Slowly, the trust he had built over years began to crack. At first, he tried to explain, to show that the accident was not due to carelessness, but no one wanted to listen. The hospital administration conducted an investigation. The press got involved. Headlines questioned his competence. For Elias, the shame was unbearable. He could not stay. His reputation was ruined, and he felt trapped by the judgment of others. With a heavy heart, he left Boston. He abandoned the hospital, his apartment, and even the life he had carefully built. He became a fugitive of his own making, not because of the law, but because of the invisible chains of shame and guilt that followed him wherever he went. He carried only a few belongings, including a small, worn medical kit, the few tools he refused to leave behind. He did not plan to stop practicing medicine. He could not. Medicine was not just a job. It was the part of him that gave life meaning. Without it, he felt empty, like a man who had lost his own shadow. The Southwest became his new home, a vast land of deserts, mountains, and lonely roads that stretched for miles without a single town in sight. Here, anonymity was possible. No one knew his name, and he could live without the judgment that had chased him out of Boston. He traveled slowly, on horseback at times, sometimes on foot, sleeping under the stars or in abandoned cabins. The desert was harsh and unforgiving, but it had a strange beauty that made him feel alive. The red rocks, the endless horizon, and the quiet wind through the canyons reminded him that life was bigger than mistakes. Despite the isolation, Monroe could not ignore the call of medicine. He treated anyone who needed help. Travelers with broken bones, minors with infections, or families too far from a proper hospital. Often he charged nothing, asking only for shelter or food in return. His reputation as a skilled healer spread quietly. People whispered about the mysterious doctor who appeared out of nowhere, saving lives and then disappearing as if he were a ghost. Sometimes he feared being recognized, worried that someone from Boston might catch up to him. But those fears were outweighed by the chance to help someone in need. Each life he saved became a small measure of redemption. Even in the middle of nowhere, challenges were constant. Supplies ran low quickly, and improvisation became a daily skill. Bandages had to be washed and reused, herbs substituted for medications, and simple tools modified for complicated surgeries. Every patient was a puzzle, and every operation was a test of his skill and patience. But these challenges reminded him why he had become a doctor in the first place. He did not need praise or recognition. He needed to act. The desert became his classroom and his stage, and every life he saved was proof that he still mattered. Loneliness, however, was always present. There were nights when he sat by a small fire, listening to the coyotes howling in the distance, and he thought about what he had lost. He remembered the bustling streets of Boston, the laughter of friends, and the quiet moments of contentment in his apartment. He thought of the patients he could no longer see and the family he had never built. The weight of his mistakes pressed heavily on him, and yet there was a strange peace in knowing that every life he touched here mattered more than any headline or public opinion. On one such night, as the desert wind whispered through the canyons, Elias looked at his hands. They were scarred from years of surgeries and rough travel. Yet they were still capable. He flexed his fingers, imagining the instruments, the careful movements, the delicate work that had once earned him praise. Those hands, he realized, were more than tools. They were a promise to himself and to the world that he could still do good. He had failed in one life, but here, in this remote and unforgiving land, he had a chance to start again. Not for fame, not for recognition, but for the pure purpose of saving lives. His travels were not easy. Some days brought harsh storms, blistering heat, or injuries that made even simple walking a challenge. Supplies were always scarce. He had to find clean water, sometimes digging or walking long distances. Food was often limited, and sometimes he relied on the kindness of strangers, travelers, ranchers, or small-town shopkeepers. Every act of generosity reminded him of the good still in the world, and every life he saved reminded him of his own worth. Elias had learned to move quietly and without drawing attention. He had a small, faded journal where he recorded medical observations, notes about herbal remedies, and sketches of injuries and surgeries. This journal was a lifeline, a way to keep his mind sharp and to leave a record of his work for anyone who might benefit from it. He often thought of it as a silent witness, watching over his journey, reminding him that even when the world rejected him, he could still make a difference. As he traveled, he also observed the people around him. The miners, ranchers, and native communities had struggles of their own. They were resilient, adapting to a harsh land with courage and dignity. Elias learned from them as much as he healed them. He discovered new ways to treat injuries using local plants, new methods of managing pain, and even ways to prevent illness in small, remote communities. Each lesson was a small victory, each success a quiet triumph. And yet, despite the success, he could not ignore the longing for redemption. He knew that one day there might be a test he could not avoid, a situation where his skill, courage, and wisdom would be challenged more than ever before. He had faced the consequences of his past, and now the desert was teaching him patience, resilience, and humility. In the vast emptiness, he began to understand what it meant to truly serve others without expectation. Every broken arm he set, every fever he treated, and every life he saved was another step toward making peace with the man he once was and the man he hoped to become. And so, Elias Monroe walked on, the sun rising and setting over the desert, each day a challenge, each night a moment of reflection. He was a fugitive in the eyes of the law, a stranger to society, and yet he was exactly where he needed to be. The desert had no judgment, only opportunity. And Elias knew that one day that opportunity would come in a form he could not yet imagine. A test not just of skill, but of heart. Until that day, he would continue to walk, to heal, and to quietly reclaim the life he thought he had lost forever. Elias Monroe had been traveling through the desert for weeks, following a narrow dirt trail that led him past red cliffs, dry riverbeds, and scattered settlements that seemed to appear from nowhere. The sun had burned his skin, the wind had stripped the moisture from his throat, and yet he pressed on. He had learned to move quietly, almost like a shadow, observing the land and the people who lived there. He carried his medical kit carefully in a worn leather bag, knowing that he might be needed at any moment. But he had grown used to the quiet. Life in the desert was often slow, measured in the steps of his horse, the rise and fall of the sun, and the occasional sound of distant wildlife. One late afternoon, while Elias rested near a small spring, he overheard a conversation between two riders approaching from the north. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices carrying a mix of fear and urgency. "She's hurt badly," one said. "Her leg, the horse threw her, and she's bleeding. If someone doesn't help soon, she won't make it through the night." The words struck Elias immediately. His pulse quickened. He had seen injuries like this before, and he knew the risks. Time mattered, and so did skill. Without hesitation, he swung his bag over his shoulder and followed the riders at a careful distance, making sure he remained unnoticed until he could assess the situation. The trail led him to a small clearing where a group of Apache villagers had gathered around a young woman lying on the ground. Her leg was twisted unnaturally, and dried blood stained her clothes. She was pale, her eyes half closed, and each shallow breath made Elias's heart tighten. The villagers looked tense, their faces marked by fear and uncertainty. They had heard of outsiders, some good, some dangerous. Trust was not given easily, but Elias knew that hesitation could cost her life. He approached slowly, keeping his hands visible, speaking softly. "I'm a doctor. I can help her." She can live if I act now." The villagers exchanged wary glances. One older woman stepped forward, speaking in their language, but her eyes met Elias's with a silent question. Could he be trusted? Elias nodded solemnly, then began preparing his kit on a nearby rock. Bandages were unrolled, herbs and tinctures placed carefully, and a small knife sterilized as best he could gleamed in the late sunlight. The villagers watched in tense silence. Elias could feel their skepticism, but also their desperate hope. The young woman groaned softly, a sound that made Elias move faster. Every second counted. He knelt beside her and examined the injury carefully. The bone in her leg was broken badly, and the surrounding tissue was swollen and bruised. Infection would come quickly if the wound was not cleaned properly. He whispered reassurances to her, not because he expected her to understand fully, but because words sometimes carried a small comfort even in pain. Elias's mind raced through everything he had learned over the years. He had performed surgeries in sterile hospitals with teams of nurses and advanced equipment. Now, in the middle of a desert clearing, he had nothing but his skills, his hands, and a handful of basic tools. The operation had to be done immediately. Elias asked the villagers to fetch clean water and soft cloths while he prepared her leg. The woman whimpered as he worked, but he held her gently, talking to her, keeping her calm. He had to set the bone carefully, realign torn tissue, and prevent further bleeding. Every movement required precision. One mistake could cause permanent damage or worse. He improvised, using herbal antiseptics and boiled water to clean the wound, tightly wrapping it with strips of cloth that would act as temporary bandages. The villagers watched intently, some holding their breath, some silently praying. Night fell slowly, and Elias kept working under the dim light of a lantern. Shadows danced across the clearing and the wind whispered through the nearby trees. The operation was long, exhausting, and dangerous. Elias's hands ached, his back burned from bending over, but he did not pause. He worked steadily, carefully, as though the life of this woman rested entirely in his hands, because it did. At one point he paused only to check her pulse and breath. She was weak but alive, a fact that gave him strength. The villagers, who had started the evening with fear, began to show small signs of trust. They brought water, helped stabilize her, and even offered blankets to keep her warm. Elias improvised anesthesia by using a combination of herbal remedies and deep, controlled breathing techniques to help dull the pain. The woman's groans became less frequent as he worked, and he focused on the task with complete concentration. Every twist, cut, and adjustment had to be precise. His mind recalled every similar surgery he had ever performed, adapting the techniques to fit the limited resources he had. At one point, he had to use a piece of wood to stabilize the leg while he worked, his hands moving quickly but carefully. Time seemed to stretch. Hours passed, but Elias barely noticed the exhaustion. He was fully present, fully determined to save her. The villagers began to quietly support him, offering food, blankets, and encouragement. Some even held the young woman's hand while Elias worked, silently showing faith in the stranger who had appeared at their darkest hour. The experience was not just about surgery. It was about trust, courage, and human connection. Elias felt the weight of the responsibility, but also the weight of hope. If he succeeded, a life would continue. If he failed, there would be grief and regret. His focus never wavered. Finally, as dawn approached, the immediate danger passed. The leg was set as well as it could be in such conditions. Elias cleaned and wrapped the wound carefully, making sure circulation was not cut off. The young woman was pale, but breathing steadily. Relief washed over him, but he knew this was only the first step. Healing would take days, and the risk of infection remained. The villagers, once cautious and distant, now looked at him with quiet respect. They had seen a stranger risk everything for one of their own, and that act had earned a fragile trust. Elias stayed with them, tending to her through the night and into the morning. He gave instructions for basic care, showing them how to change bandages and prevent infection. He taught them simple methods to manage pain using herbs and natural remedies found in the desert. The villagers listened carefully, following his guidance, and slowly the young woman began to regain some strength. Each small improvement brought a sense of hope. Elias felt something he had not felt in years, that he was making a real difference, not for recognition or payment, but because it was the right thing to do. During those days, Elias observed the community. The Apache people lived in a harsh land, but with resilience, dignity, and deep connection to one another. They shared what little they had, cared for each other, and respected life in all its forms. Elias learned from them as much as he helped. He discovered remedies, survival skills, and ways of living in harmony with the desert that he had never known. Slowly, he began to understand that this remote world, once lonely and intimidating, could also be a place of learning, growth, and unexpected human connection. The young woman began to show signs of recovery, her breathing more even, her eyes brighter. She could sit up with support, and small smiles started to appear. Elias felt a quiet satisfaction, but he remained vigilant. The hardest part was yet to come, getting her walking again, ensuring her leg healed properly, and preparing her to return to her daily life. He knew this would take weeks, and his presence would be necessary. The villagers, once wary, now treated him with respect and offered small comforts. They brought food, water, and blankets, and quietly observed his every move, seeing him not as an outsider, but as someone who had risked everything for them. Through it all, Elias reflected on how fragile life could be. One wrong step, one miscalculation, and the young woman might not have survived. He thought about his own mistakes in the past, and how shame and guilt had driven him into exile. Now, in the desert, helping someone who had no other options, he felt a measure of redemption. It was not about public praise or returning to Boston. It was about the quiet knowledge that he could still save lives, even when trust was scarce. By the end of the week, the woman was stable and more comfortable. She still needed support, and the healing process would take time, but she had survived. Elias had gained something too, a sense of purpose, a glimpse of hope, and proof that his hands, though once blamed, could still create life and comfort. The villagers now looked at him differently. They were no longer suspicious. They were grateful. Some spoke softly to him, thanking him in words he barely understood, but felt deeply. And so, as Elias prepared for what lay ahead, the long recovery, the daily care, and the quiet rebuilding of trust, he realized that this encounter was only the beginning. The desert had tested him, challenged him, and now offered him a chance to truly make a difference. He was a fugitive, yes, but in this moment he was also a healer, a protector, and a witness to human resilience. The young woman's survival was proof that even in the harshest conditions, courage, skill, and compassion could change lives. The night had fallen over the small Apache settlement, casting long shadows across the rocky ground. Elias Monroe sat beside the young woman, now awake but weak, her leg carefully propped on a pile of blankets. He could see the fear in her eyes, the fear of pain, of the unknown, and perhaps of the stranger who had suddenly entered her life. He spoke softly. "I'm here to help. I won't let anything happen to you." His words were calm, steady, meant to reassure both her and the watching villagers. The injury was worse than he had initially thought. While the leg had been roughly set during the first emergency care, the bone had not aligned properly. Swelling had increased overnight, and there were signs of early infection. If he did not act now, he could lose the leg, or worse, her life. He took a deep breath, centering himself. The desert had taught him patience, improvisation, and focus, but this would be the most challenging surgery he had performed in years. Elias prepared his makeshift surgical area. A lantern flickered, casting dancing shadows on the dirt ground. He arranged his tools carefully. A small scalpel, forceps, clean cloths, sterilized water, and herbal antiseptics. Each tool had a purpose, and he knew that mistakes were not an option. He glanced at the villagers who watched silently, their faces a mix of hope and fear. Some of them had never seen a surgery performed outside a hospital, and the sight of a man working by lantern light in the middle of the desert was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. He knelt beside the woman, her eyes filled with trust and anxiety. Elias whispered, "I need you to stay as still as you can. It will hurt, but you are strong. We will get through this together." He had no modern anesthetic, no sophisticated equipment, only his skill, knowledge, and the natural remedies he carried. He applied a herbal mixture to the wound to reduce pain and infection, then stabilized the leg using a piece of sturdy wood he had fashioned into a splint. The first incision was the hardest. Elias's hands moved quickly but deliberately, recalling every detail of surgeries performed in hospitals long ago. The tissue around the fracture was damaged and bruised, requiring careful cleaning. He worked silently, only speaking occasionally to give reassurance. The woman's groans and quick breaths filled the air, mingling with the faint sound of the wind and the distant howl of a coyote. Every movement had to be precise. A slip could endanger her life. Hours passed slowly. Elias had to remove damaged tissue, align the bone properly, and control bleeding with limited resources. He improvised clamps from clean sticks, tied makeshift sutures, and used cloth strips to secure the splint. Sweat dripped down his forehead, mixing with the dust of the desert. His back ached, and his hands were cramped, but he did not pause. He knew the stakes, and he could not afford distraction. The villagers, who had begun the night skeptical, now assisted quietly. One held a lantern, another provided clean water, and a third offered blankets to keep the woman warm. Their cautious trust gave him strength. At one point, a sudden movement startled him. The young woman had flinched, causing a slight shift in her leg. Elias's heart jumped, but he held her gently, whispering words of comfort. "It's okay, stay still. You're doing well." He adjusted the instruments, realigned the bone, and continued. In moments like these, he thought about why he had left Boston and the mistakes that had haunted him. All the shame, the guilt, and the fear of judgment faded, replaced by a singular focus: saving this life. Time seemed to stretch. The night was long, but Elias kept working. He had to ensure the bone was properly aligned, that the wound was cleaned to prevent infection, and that the leg was stabilized for healing. Every movement was deliberate. He checked her pulse frequently, adjusted bandages, and monitored her breathing. Each small success, reduced bleeding, her weaker groans, her steadying pulse, was a victory. The villagers noticed, whispering to each other in relief as they watched the stranger work tirelessly, a man who risked everything to help someone not his own. Elias used a combination of traditional and improvised methods to manage pain. He instructed the woman to focus on breathing slowly while applying herbal compresses to reduce swelling. The wind from the desert cooled their sweat-covered skin, and the lantern flickered, sometimes dimming almost to darkness. He pressed on, aware that daylight would soon arrive, but that the surgery could not pause. Nature had no mercy, and the woman's survival depended entirely on his skill and perseverance. The tension was palpable. The villagers were silent, their eyes wide, each heartbeat echoing the uncertainty of the moment. For Elias, the operation was more than just saving a leg. It was a test of everything he had learned, everything he had become. His past failures had brought him here, and this was his chance to prove that he could still save lives even when circumstances were impossible. Each careful movement reminded him why he had devoted his life to medicine. It was not about recognition, wealth, or fame, but about preserving life when all hope seemed lost. Hours turned into what felt like an eternity. Finally, after carefully cleaning, aligning, and stabilizing the leg, Elias completed the most critical part of the operation. He wrapped the leg tightly with cloth strips, secured the splint, and ensured that blood flow was not cut off. The woman was exhausted, her breathing slow and more even. Elias gently patted her shoulder and whispered, "You did it. You're safe now. We've made it through the worst." Relief washed over him, but he knew this was only the beginning. Healing would take days, and complications could still arise. The villagers now looked at Elias with something approaching respect and gratitude. They had watched him risk his own comfort and safety to save one of their own. One elder quietly handed him water. Another offered bread. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. They did not know his name, or where he had come from, or the life he had left behind. They only knew that he had saved a life when it mattered most. For Elias, this silent acknowledgement was more valuable than any reward or recognition he had ever received in Boston. Through the night, Elias continued to monitor the woman. He applied gentle compresses, ensured she remained hydrated, and encouraged her to breathe deeply. He also instructed the villagers in basic care, how to change the bandages carefully, how to move her safely. They listened attentively, understanding that the survival of one of their own depended on these careful actions. Elias realized that this was not just a surgery. It was teaching, sharing knowledge, and empowering a community to care for their own. As the first light of dawn touched the desert, the operation was complete. The immediate danger had passed. The woman's leg was stabilized, bleeding controlled, and she was alive. Elias allowed himself a brief moment to rest, leaning against a rock, feeling the exhaustion of the night settle into his bones. His hands were raw and sore, his back stiff, but he felt a deep sense of accomplishment. He had saved a life under conditions that would have challenged even the most experienced surgeons. He had faced fear, uncertainty, and physical limits, and he had prevailed. The young woman opened her eyes, weak but alive. A faint smile appeared on her lips as she looked at Elias. She could not speak much, but her eyes conveyed understanding and gratitude.
Elias nodded to her gently, knowing that words were unnecessary. The villagers had seen a stranger perform what seemed impossible, and their quiet respect was evident.
Elias also felt a quiet pride, not for recognition, but for the knowledge that he had made a real difference, that his skills, honed over years of practice, could still save lives in the most challenging circumstances. By mid-morning, Elias helped the woman settle on blankets in a shaded area. He provided water and soft food, carefully monitoring her condition. The villagers, now more relaxed, began to help him care for her. Some brought herbs, others water, and a few stayed nearby to watch and learn. Elias spoke softly to them, demonstrating proper care techniques and explaining the importance of rest and hygiene. He realized that this operation, dangerous and exhausting as it was, had created a bond between him and the community, a bond built on trust, courage, and the shared goal of saving a life.
As he packed up his tools, Elias reflected on the night.
The desert had tested his skill, patience, and determination, and he had passed. But more than that, it had reminded him why he had chosen medicine: to serve, to heal, and to bring hope where it seemed impossible. He understood now that redemption was not about fame or forgiveness from others. It was about action, compassion, and commitment. In the quiet aftermath of the surgery, with the young woman recovering and the villagers watching respectfully, Elias felt a renewed sense of purpose. The morning sun rose slowly over the Apache settlement, casting a warm golden light over the rocky ground. Elias Monroe had spent the night beside the young woman, keeping watch as she slept fitfully. Her breathing was uneven at times, and he gently adjusted her blankets, checking her leg for swelling or signs of pain. Each small movement reminded him how fragile life could be, yet how resilient the human body was when given proper care. The night's surgery had saved her life, but healing would take days, even weeks. Elias knew that recovery required patience, attention, and constant care. By mid-morning, the young woman was awake. She moved cautiously, her face tight with discomfort, but she smiled weakly at Elias. He nodded reassuringly and spoke softly. "You are doing well. Every day will get easier. You are stronger than you know." She did not speak much English, but his tone, his gestures, and the gentle care he had shown made his words clear. Trust was slowly growing between them, a fragile bond formed in the most intense of circumstances. The villagers watched closely. They had witnessed the stranger's skill during the operation, and now they observed his care during the recovery. Some brought food, soft bread, or water, while others offered blankets or herbs. Elias guided them carefully, showing them how to wash the wound, change the bandages, and keep the leg elevated. He explained why hygiene mattered, why swelling had to be monitored, and how to help the young woman move without causing pain. Slowly, the community began to understand that he was not only skilled but also patient and gentle. They had given him cautious trust before, but now that trust was deepening into quiet respect. Days passed. Elias remained with the young woman, checking her progress and adjusting the splint as needed. At first, she could only sit up with assistance. He would gently support her as she shifted, giving clear instructions. "Slowly, one step at a time, we will go further tomorrow." Each day she gained a little strength. Her groans of pain became less frequent, and her eyes brightened. Elias was careful not to rush her, knowing that patience was as important as skill in the recovery process. The villagers, once wary, began to participate more actively. They learned from Elias, helping to prepare food that was soft and easy to eat, cleaning her blankets and checking on her comfort. Children would watch quietly, curious about the stranger who had come to help one of their own. Some elders shared knowledge about herbs and traditional remedies, which Elias integrated carefully into his care plan. Together, they created a small support network around the woman, a community effort guided by Elias's skill and the villagers' dedication. During the day, Elias also observed the environment. The Apache settlement was remote, built in harmony with the desert landscape. Families lived close together, sharing resources and responsibilities. Water was scarce and every drop was valued. The people hunted and gathered food carefully, used herbs and plants for medicine, and respected the land they called home. Elias was struck by their resilience. He had spent so long in cities and hospitals, surrounded by equipment and schedules. Here, in the desert, he saw life at its simplest and strongest, and he realized that healing was not only about medicine but also about care, connection, and community. One afternoon, as Elias helped the young woman sit up, she tried to speak to him in her own language. He could not understand the words, but he noticed the smile that accompanied them. He responded with a nod and a gentle touch on her arm, signaling understanding. Communication was not perfect, but trust and empathy bridged the gap. Elias began to see that healing was not just physical, it was emotional, and the bonds formed during vulnerability were as important as any surgical procedure. Elias also faced small challenges. The desert was harsh. Heat during the day made movement difficult, and the nights were cold. Supplies were limited, and he had to improvise solutions constantly. Water for cleaning wounds was scarce. Bandages had to be washed and reused carefully, and food had to be prepared to provide nutrients without causing strain. Yet, every challenge reinforced his determination. He remembered why he had become a doctor in the first place: to help when it was hardest, to care when no one else could. The young woman's recovery became a symbol of that purpose. As the week went on, she began to walk short distances with support. Elias guided her carefully, holding her hand, reminding her to place her weight evenly, and encouraging her to breathe steadily. Her confidence grew slowly, and each successful step was celebrated quietly. The villagers cheered softly, proud of her progress, and grateful for Elias's guidance. In these moments, Elias felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had risked everything to save a life, and now he was witnessing the transformation that came with careful, compassionate care. During this time, Elias also reflected on his own journey. He had fled Boston, carrying shame and guilt for past mistakes. For years he had felt lost, a man running from himself. Yet now in the desert he realized that redemption was not about returning to a city, clearing his name, or regaining lost status. It was about action, integrity, and the quiet knowledge that he could still make a difference. Saving this young woman, teaching the villagers, and restoring health in a remote community gave him a renewed sense of purpose. He was reclaiming the part of himself that had been buried under fear and regret. The young woman, too, began to show subtle changes. Her eyes sparkled. More often, she laughed softly at small jokes or playful gestures, and her dependence on others lessened. Elias noticed how the community's care had helped her regain confidence, showing him that healing was a collaborative process. The villagers were no longer distant observers. They were active participants, learning, caring, and supporting. Elias felt proud, not only of his own efforts, but of the way the community had rallied to protect and help one of their own. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant colors across the desert sky, Elias sat quietly outside the small dwelling where the young woman rested. The wind was gentle, carrying the scent of sage and dry earth. He thought about how far he had come, from the scandal in Boston to this remote settlement where his skills mattered more than ever. He realized that life offered second chances in unexpected ways. The desert, once a place of exile, had become a place of learning, growth, and healing. He had found meaning not in recognition, but in action. As days turned into weeks, the young woman's strength increased. She could walk short distances without assistance, eat meals independently, and even perform small tasks around the settlement. Elias continued to guide her, teaching careful movements and exercises to strengthen the leg. The villagers watched and learned, incorporating his instructions into their routines. A sense of normalcy returned, and with it, hope. The settlement had become not just a place of survival, but a place of recovery, resilience, and quiet joy. Elias also began to form connections with the villagers beyond Madison. He listened to their stories, learned about their traditions, and shared his own experiences in small, careful ways. They respected him not just for his skill, but for his humility and dedication. The bond he had created was mutual. He cared for them, and they cared for him. In these moments, Elias understood the deeper meaning of healing. It was not just the repair of broken bones, but the rebuilding of trust, confidence, and community. By the end of the recovery period, the young woman was strong enough to walk confidently with the villagers' support. She smiled easily now, laughing quietly as she performed daily chores. Elias felt a profound satisfaction, knowing that his work had not only saved her life but restored a sense of independence and dignity. The villagers treated him with respect, offering gratitude in gestures, words, and quiet acknowledgement. They had witnessed a stranger risk everything for one of their own, and that act had forged a lasting bond. Elias reflected on the experience as he prepared for what was next. He knew his time in the settlement would eventually end. His journey through the desert was ongoing, and other people would need his help. Yet he also realized that this place, these people, and this young woman had changed him as much as he had helped them. He had found a sense of purpose, a connection to life, and a deeper understanding of what it meant to heal. Redemption, he now knew, was measured not in fame or recognition, but in quiet, persistent action. As he packed his medical kit, Elias looked at the young woman one last time before he would leave. She was standing confidently, surrounded by the villagers who had supported her through recovery. Her eyes met his, and a silent understanding passed between them. He had saved her life, yes, but more than that, he had given her strength, hope, and a sense of security. In turn, she and the community had given him trust, respect, and a glimpse of redemption he had long thought impossible. And so, as Elias prepared to continue his journey through the vast, unforgiving desert, he carried with him a renewed sense of purpose. The desert had tested him, challenged him, and shown him that even in the harshest conditions, courage, compassion, and skill could transform lives. He had healed a young woman, touched a community, and in the process begun to heal himself. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in years, Elias felt that he was exactly where he was meant to be. A healer, a teacher, and a quiet force of hope in a world that often seemed unforgiving. The sun rose slowly over the desert, painting the sky with soft shades of pink and gold. Elias Monroe sat quietly outside the small dwelling where the young woman had recovered, taking in the morning air. For weeks he had stayed with her, helping her heal, teaching the villagers how to care for her, and slowly regaining a sense of purpose that had long been buried. Now, he knew his time in the settlement was coming to an end. Other people in the desert would need his help, and he could not remain in one place forever. He looked at the young woman, standing confidently with the villagers nearby. She had regained her strength, her movements were steady, and she had even begun helping others with small tasks. Her eyes met his, and in that silent moment, Elias understood the depth of the connection they had built. He had saved her life, yes, but he had also helped her regain confidence and independence. She had taught him as much about trust, courage, and resilience as he had taught her about healing. The villagers approached him quietly, offering small gifts and gestures of thanks. A basket of food, a blanket, and a small carved figure were placed in his hands. Elias accepted them with humility, knowing that these tokens were not just gratitude. They were respect and trust, earned through weeks of dedication. The elders nodded at him silently, their eyes reflecting understanding and appreciation. Elias felt a warmth in his chest, a feeling he had not experienced in years. For the first time, he understood that his actions had meaning beyond recognition, beyond status, beyond his past mistakes. He packed his medical kit carefully, making sure nothing was left behind that could be useful to the villagers. He checked the supplies, cleaned the tools, and wrapped the instruments securely. Each item reminded him of the nights he had spent tending to injuries, improvising with what he had and staying vigilant through pain, exhaustion, and uncertainty. Those nights had been grueling, but they had also been transformative. He had faced the desert, faced fear, and faced the possibility of failure, and he had succeeded. The young woman approached him, her step steady but cautious. She placed her hand briefly on his arm, a silent gesture of gratitude and farewell. Elias smiled gently and whispered, "Take care of yourself. Keep walking. You are stronger than you know." She nodded, and a small tear glistened in her eye. He knew that words were not enough, but the bond they had built was felt more than spoken. Trust, respect, and care had bridged their differences in language, culture, and circumstance. Elias realized that this moment, this farewell, was as important as any surgery he had ever performed. He mounted his horse slowly, feeling the familiar weight of the leather saddle beneath him. The desert stretched endlessly before him, a mixture of red cliffs, dry riverbeds, and rolling hills. It was a harsh land, but it had taught him resilience, patience, and humility. For years he had run from his past, believing that mistakes defined him. But now, he understood that redemption was not about erasing the past. It was about the choices he made today, the lives he touched, and the courage he showed in the face of uncertainty. As he rode away from the settlement, Elias thought about the journey that had brought him here. He remembered the scandal in Boston, the shame and guilt that had driven him into exile, and the loneliness that had followed him across miles of desert. He had believed that he was beyond repair, that his skill and dedication no longer mattered. But in saving the young woman, in helping the community, and in facing the challenges of the desert with determination and compassion, he had discovered something he had thought lost forever: purpose. The wind whipped against his face as he rode, carrying the scent of sage and dry earth. The landscape was vast and silent, yet it spoke to him in subtle ways. Each rock, each tree, each distant sound reminded him that life continued beyond any single mistake. He reflected on the lessons he had learned in the settlement. That trust could be earned through consistent action, that courage often came quietly, and that healing was as much about patience and care as it was about skill. These lessons would guide him in the days ahead, wherever his travels took him. Elias also thought about the villagers and the young woman. They had given him something he had long sought but never found in a hospital or city: a sense of connection. He realized that medicine was not just about procedures and techniques. It was about human relationships, empathy, and understanding. In the weeks he had spent in the settlement, he had learned to see beyond the injury, beyond the immediate problem, to the whole person and the community that surrounded them. This holistic understanding of healing was more valuable than any certificate or accolade he had ever earned. The young woman's progress was a source of quiet pride for Elias. She had gone from being weak, fearful, and dependent to standing tall, walking with confidence and participating actively in her community. Watching her regain strength and independence was like watching a flower bloom after a harsh winter. Each small success, each step she took without support, reminded him why he had chosen medicine in the first place. He had been given a second chance, not only to help her but to heal himself in the process. As the day wore on, Elias rode further into the desert, the settlement slowly disappearing behind the cliffs and rocks. He felt a mixture of sadness and fulfillment. Leaving was difficult. He had grown attached to the people who had welcomed him and trusted him so fully. Yet he knew that his journey could not end here. The desert was vast and many others needed care, guidance, and healing. He carried with him the lessons of this experience, ready to face new challenges with renewed strength, wisdom, and compassion. The desert tested him in ways he had never imagined. Harsh weather, rough terrain, and scarcity of supplies had pushed him to his limits. But these challenges had also strengthened him, sharpened his skills, and taught him resilience. He reflected on how different life in Boston had been: structured, predictable, and constrained by rules. Here, in the open desert, he was free to act on his instincts, to make decisions in real time, and to use all of his knowledge and skill without limitation. This freedom came with responsibility, and he had risen to meet it. As night approached, Elias found a small ridge overlooking a valley, and he paused to rest. The sky was a deep, star-filled expanse, and the silence of the desert was profound. He dismounted and sat on a rock, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought about the mistakes he had made, the shame that had driven him away from Boston, and the fear that had followed him across deserts and mountains. But he also thought about what he had gained: trust, respect, purpose, and a renewed sense of self-worth. He realized that redemption was not a destination but a process, one that required courage, dedication, and compassion.
In that quiet moment, Elias made a promise to himself. He would continue to walk the desert, helping those who needed him most.
He would face danger, exhaustion, and uncertainty without hesitation, guided by the knowledge that his actions could make a real difference. Fame, recognition, or wealth no longer mattered. What mattered was life, healing, and the quiet impact he could have on others. He understood now that every patient he helped, every person he comforted, and every community he served was a step toward true redemption. The young woman's face lingered in his thoughts as he rode through the night. Her strength, courage, and resilience reminded him that people could endure hardships and emerge stronger. She had trusted him when others might not have, and he had honored that trust with skill, patience, and care. Elias realized that the most meaningful part of his journey was not just the lives he saved, but the relationships he built, the trust he earned, and the hope he inspired. These intangible gifts, he understood, were worth more than any recognition or validation he could have received in the past. As dawn approached again, Elias rode on, the desert stretching endlessly before him. He knew that challenges lay ahead, that there would be more injuries, more communities in need, and more moments of fear and uncertainty. Yet he felt ready. He had faced the worst, and he had succeeded. He had saved a life, gained trust, and, in the process, begun to heal himself. Each step of the journey reinforced a simple truth. Redemption was not about erasing the past, but about living with courage, integrity, and compassion in the present. Elias looked ahead to the horizon, the sun rising over the red rocks and valleys of the desert. He felt a deep sense of peace. The desert, once a place of exile, had become a place of learning, growth, and healing.